I wanted to take a minute to talk about how I like to set up ZBrush and a few things about how I like to work. Um, First of all, let's get rid of this. One of the first things I do is I'll initialize just a quick way of maximizing the space here. Um, as you can see here, I do have a custom UI. It's not drastically different, just me getting rid of some things I never use and adding things that I do. Depending on, well, let me just make something here. I'll usually turn on rotate on a y-axis. That way it'll rotate around up and from a vertical axis, and more like how a typical 3D modeling package like Maya would work. I just feel like it's more intuitive for me to work that way most of the time, instead of XYZ where it'll kind of rotate and orbit all over the place. Whoops. Let me change the matcap. And another thing I like to do is I like to get rid of the gradient in the background. For some reason, it's just not something that makes it any easier for me to work with. In fact, it usually just confuses my eye. And typically, I also change the background color. In this case, it doesn't really matter too much. But I do, depending on if the model is dark, I'll try to contrast it with a lighter background, and vice versa. Make this Mesh 3D, and I work in orthographic view. Actually, I don't know, maybe 90% of the time. And it's kind of funny. Anytime anyone walks over to my desk and sees what I'm working on, the first thing they'll ask me to do is turn on perspective. I guess it's just easier for most people to digest what the model really looks like when there's some perspective to it. I don't know why, but for me, it's not that big of a deal, and I don't think my final result suffers too much from that. I will switch it back once in a while, and although with a lower angle view, so just so that it's a bit more of like a telephoto than a wide angle. But yeah, most of the time I'll just keep it off, and hopefully that doesn't bug anyone too much in this video. Let's go ahead and move on to some of the brushes I like to use. The first thing I will say is that I almost never use a standard brush, at least not the way it was meant to be used. It's actually kind of been relegated to my alpha brush. If I need to use alpha, I'll put it on the standard brush just so that it doesn't affect any of the other brushes that I use more often. And the reason for this is, let me go ahead and just sculpt something real quick here. Like, let's say you wanted to brush on top of this. Using the standard brush, it kind of moves everything evenly. And that's just the way it was designed to work, and probably the way most people expect things to work when they're sculpting. But for me, I like to use the clay because, let me switch to the normal clay first, because it prioritizes the deepest regions and it kind of leaves the higher parts alone. And this is just good for me because usually I will have already blocked something out, and what I want to do is even it out without having to smooth it out, because obviously smoothing it out isn't going to work in all situations. So instead, with the clay brush, I can just kind of brush things out, bring things to an even level that way. But the reason why you have to use clay buildup in particular is because, as the name suggests, it builds up. So I can just hold down the mouse button and keep going and keep going and keep going all the way until the mesh just starts falling apart. I mean, I never do it that like that, but it's just kind of more of a relaxing way for me to work. I don't have to lift my pen up so many times and press it down again. If you were to use even clay tubes, for example, it doesn't work that way. You know, you can brush over the same area over and over again, and it's never going to get that much higher. You know, depending on the situation, but most of the time, I think clay buildup is what I like to go with. And I'll also use a circular alpha on it. It's just you still get some of that grit, some of that noise, but it's a little bit more organic. And if you were to just leave it like this, it looks a little bit more purposeful than lazy, which I think if you had to square, sometimes if a person saw this on your model in the end, these harsh lines, it's just kind of obvious that you just didn't go through the trouble of cleaning things up. And yeah, it's just more of a disguise for me. It's disguising my laziness. But yeah, as you'll see later on when I show my sculpting in greater detail, you'll see that a lot of my surfaces are actually kind of messy like this, and it's something I don't mind. I know a lot of people strive for really clean, imperfect surfaces, and that's admirable, but for me, when there's some tooth to the surface, it gives something for my eye to grab onto, and not only does it look a little bit more interesting, but also it helps me read the form a little bit better, actually. I mean, in this case, it doesn't really matter because it's just a cylinder, but if it was a more complex shape, like an arm, for example, where there are more ins and outs, but they're more subtle, when everything is really smooth, it's just harder for me to see the true form of the surface, or the true form of the object. And just having some grit there, it just makes things a little bit more readable for me. And I mean, of course, at the end I do have to do some cleanup, but you know, it's not that big of a deal for me. And another thing I should say is I actually don't use smoothing. Probably I don't use it as much as other people do. I actually just kind of sculpt back in a lot. I mean, it's not helping getting a really clean and smooth surface, but I think it's something about it I find more appealing, the end result. And if really necessary, you know, I can, this is using the trim dynamic brush, by the way, I can just kind of go like this, and you know, it kind of smooths it out, but it leaves enough variation to the surface that it doesn't look too machined. I mean, unless that's what you're going for. And then I can just kind of smooth this and, you know, get something in between if I really wanted. But, you know, other than that, there aren't too many strange things about the way I work. I don't really have a whole lot of unique brushes. Probably the only one that I use that I've downloaded and that I use regularly is the Fall Off Sharp brush. Again, you just do a search for it. It's very easy to find, but it's good for drawing lines and creating these kinds of edges. By default, these days, ZBrush has the Damien Standard brush built in for this kind of thing. Um, the reason why I prefer this one is because by default Z add is on, so that you know with no other button pressed, it'll go up, and holding down Alt goes down, just like every other brush. With Damien Standard, I think it's the reverse, and I always feel like I kind of have to mentally switch gears when I use that brush. Also, this fall off brush, it feels a little bit smoother and quicker to me. I'm sure you could set up the Damien Standard brush to do the same thing with the brush settings, but you know, that's just the way I like to work here. And there's a few other things I'll get into once we start really sculpting, but for now, that's just kind of a quick overview of how I like to work. For sculpting, there are certain kinds of matte caps that I prefer to use. My primary concern is how easy it is to read the surface, how to see the forms, and less about fancy effects. I like a rather simple matte cap with mainly one direction to lighting and not too much contrast. The specular, for me, should be sort of broad, not too strong, and with an even fall off. And probably most important for me is I don't like to see any secondary reflections. This kind of rules out a lot of the more metallic looking matte caps, because you know, I think when you see another reflection or like another highlight on the side, at least for me, it makes me wonder if it's lighter because the form is changing over there, or is it because of the reflection? So it's just a little bit more confusing that way. Sometimes I'll switch to a matte cap with a stronger directional light and with a subtle rim light, something like this. Well, let me turn off wax preview. This is kind of my check, switching back and forth between something like this and the previous matte cap. I also prefer pretty neutral colors with maybe a little bit of saturation, such as this, kind of almost like a very desaturated brown. I find that when you use something that's kind of like a skin, for example, it's kind of cool because maybe you're thinking that it mimics the surface, the kind of surface material that you're ultimately want to strive for. But for me, it also introduces a little bit of distraction to what I'm seeing. So, you know, something like this is usually better for me to start working from. And then maybe later on, when I'm happy with how the model is coming, I'll switch to something else. I do tend to keep wax preview off. I know it's one of those cool things that makes your model look, you know, really neat, but it doesn't help me see anything better. And again, if anything, it's more of a distraction than anything else. But I will use it during the poly painting stage, especially if I'm working with some skin-like material.